Okay, so we've got 3 new commands to learn today, so major expansion of our CAD vocabulary here. The first one is scale. This is a bit complex of a command, more than you'd think. But I'm going to start off just by sort of drawing a sort of random little object here, kind of make it a fiery looking thing here. So I have an object. I'm going to take this object and I'm just going to copy it. So my CO command here, and we'll put 3 other ones here. So I'm going to take my first object and we're going to scale this. So we're running our scale command, which shortcut for that is just SC for scale. And the first thing we need to do is identify our base point. So like other commands, we can click on basically any point that we want. It can be a point on our object. It can be the center of our object. It can even be center of a page or different location on a page. But I'm going to put kind of my bottom midpoint here as my scale. And then the next thing it's going to ask is a factor. And so the factor, kind of as it sounds, you'll notice as I move my mouse, I can easily change the size of my object here. So a factor of 1 wouldn't scale at all. It would be 1 to 1. A factor of 0.5 would make my thing half the size. So I'll show that as an example here. So I'll go 0.5 and then hit enter. And now our thing is exactly half the size as our original one. And let's say we take that object again, and now I'm going to scale it again. I'll select this same kind of, actually this time I'll select this sort of bottom left point as our base point. You notice now I'm scaling, resizing it from that point right there. And I'm going to do a factor of 4. Now we have a larger one. All right. Now our last method of scaling, and this is something that we are probably going to do most often in the class, is we're actually going to select our unit to scale, and we're not actually going to have a factor that we're going to want to scale to. What we're going to have is some kind of reference. So an example would be, let's say I have this crown object here, and I want to scale it so the bottom is, delete these other ones here for the moment. So I have my object here, and I want to scale it so the bottom of my object is now the entire width of this point, of this line down here. Calculating the factor on that would be pretty difficult. I'd have to first measure our current baseline here, and then measure the second one and divide, and be really complicated. So thankfully CAD has a much simpler way. We're going to do scale. I'm going to select my base point, and we're going to scale from here since we're sort of stretching it to our right. And then you'll notice at the bottom here, where it's asking us where we normally punch in our factor, we have 2 other options here, copy and reference. I'm going to hit R for reference. And again, this is how we'll scale probably most often in the class. I'm going to hit R for reference. And now it's having me specify our reference length. So what we first do is select our first object that's going to be sort of our baseline. So I said that was going to be our bottom line here of our object. So I'm going to select that as kind of our reference. And then now you'll notice when I move the mouse, it's not scaling it based on a factor. It's actually stretching it, that bottom base point, all along, and so I can snap that to my endpoint here, and now I have this object perfectly scaled so that my baseline is now the exact same dimension as the other line there was originally. To demonstrate that again in a slightly different way here, say I have 2 points. I've got a point here, and I've got another point here. And say I want to scale this object so that this point on my object here is the same distance as these 2 points across. So to demonstrate that, I'm going to select everything here. I'll hit scale. Spell it correctly here. Hello. Okay. So select this. Scale. So this time I'm going to select this bottom point as my base point. I will notice, it's starting to scale here. We're going to hit R for reference. Again, I'm going to take the same base point there. And I'm going to take this point here, because this is the point I'm going to stretch. And I'm going to go from here, and I'm going to stretch it to our base point here. And so now if I were to take a dimension, I would see, even though these don't snap up correctly, they're the exact same distance from our base point here. So I gave you a fairly complex assignment for today that's got a number of objects that you need to scale. And again, as we draw stuff, I'm intentionally going to give you assignments that would be challenging to draw without using the commands that we've learned. So you want to use the copy command when you see repetitive elements, so you're not constantly redrawing these elements. And when you see repetitive elements that are different sizes, you're going to use your scale command in order to quickly and efficiently redraw those as opposed to scaling from scratch. Okay, so that's our first command for today, scale. The next one is, actually I'll leave this up. Our next one is line weight. So in CAD we can actually select objects and have them be, these lines can actually be different thicknesses. And there's a few ways of specifying that. We can either select the line, so let's say I just want to have the top portion of my lines here, and I want them to be thicker. So we go over here to our properties section here, and we see something here that says line weight. So I'm going to click on that. We have all these different thicknesses here. So if I go to thickness of 1 millimeter here, we see this nice and thick here. And the thing about line weights is they stay the same thickness on your screen as you zoom in and out. So, looking at the image far away, these lines look really, really thick. But then as you zoom in, they don't seem as thick. They're still thicker than the other lines, but they're always going to stay exactly 1 millimeter, no matter how far you zoom in. When you print, it's a different story as far as looking at them in what we call our model space, which is what we're looking at now. This is how that looks. So we can just set our thickness here. We can also set thicknesses by layer. Going to our layers options here. Okay, so I can click on a what am I? My 0 layer here. So 0 layer, and then here at the bottom we see we're in our layers properties. This looks much different in Windows, so if you're at home watching this video, there's a separate video that I'll show you on how to access all this in Windows. But for Mac here, I can go to line weight and I can actually set all of my thicknesses just based off of the layer. So here I did a much thicker line for the whole layer, and then I just did a smaller line for these ones that I manually did. Alright, I'm going to set this back to our defaults. I'll delete this. Okay, our last command is a ellipse, which an ellipse is kind of like a circle with two different radiuses. There's two radii. And there's a couple different ways we can access our ellipse tool. We can type in EL, which is the shortcut for ellipse. There's also a button on our toolbar, which if we click and hold, it gives us basically two ways of drawing ellipses. And then we can also go to draw, and it's probably in here somewhere. Here we go, ellipse. Different types here. But things are always quicker, usually just using our command, so EL. And we first start by punching in a axis. So I'm just going to kind of click randomly here. And at the end, if the inner axis here, we have basically a circle, but you'll notice now we're sort of squeezing or stretching our circle to make our ellipse. So I'm not exactly sure why they do it this way, but there's the two different methods here. So we can specify our center point, draw our first radius, and then go through into our second radius. Or the other option is an axis and then a center point. So we can go all the way across. We can even go diagonally here on our axis, and then we can set a radius for our second dimension here.